Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. Some people say that flushing your toilet and having that sewage waste go into the ocean or your river is no big deal. They said it's treated. But you know what? I wanted to check out for myself, so I interviewed Stephanie Ware. She's a senior strategist with the Nature Conservancy, and she has most recently started to focus on this whole area of sewage treatment, of sewage pollution into our waterways. And I think you're going to be interested in what she has to say. So stay tuned. Hi, Stephanie. How are you today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a marine biologist. I've spent most of my career working to protect coral reefs and tropical locations in the world. But in the last 8 years or so, and I think this is what we're going to talk a bit about today, I've become kind of laser focused on sewage pollution and the problems that it presents both to ocean health and human health. And it's kind of funny, I've been working in this very almost sexy environment, the tropics, white sandy beaches, clear crystal blue waters. And that's where I've been tromping around the world for the last couple of decades. I've been working all that time with the Nature Conservancy. So the fact that I've gone towards this kind of like taboo, not to be discussed area that is kind of got this huge ick factor is kind of confusing to my colleagues and family. But it is a really fun and exciting space because it is such a massive problem. It's fun to break taboo as far as I'm concerned. And it's really a solvable problem. And it's one that the more I've learned about it, the more I appreciate how absurd it is that we haven't addressed it. And, and that my work now is really focused on engaging with problem solvers, better defining the problem, and really building a movement towards addressing this problem. Because it ultimately, we're talking about in the end water quality, and all of the work we do in ocean conservation, the work I've devoted my life to, is is happening in water. And so that water better be, in good condition. So if we're working on fisheries or protected areas or restoring habitat, it's really important that the water is healthy and clean and safe, both for people and for nature. So that's been my area of work more recently, but I'm happy to go beyond that. A lot of what I'm learning, and maybe we're going to get into this, is these deep connections to climate change as well. So there are these sort of this back and forth between sewage pollution and climate change that ultimately could have a really happy ending, but right now it's creating a lot of really negative impacts.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about the whole area of sewage pollution, because I see communities that there's so much hypocrisy. They say, well, we don't want that, but yet we're going to flush our stuff into the ocean. And I look at it and go, I'm not so sure that's the best solution. So can you just comment on that whole area of some of the stuff you have learned since you've started focusing on this, some of the challenges?
Yeah. So one thing I should probably start off with is that this is not, and you're already alluding to this is not a developing world problem. So we are pumping 80% of our sewage untreated into our coastal waters globally. So that means that most of our sewage isn't getting treated. It's just the ocean is becoming the solution, right? We're sort of kicking the can down the road until the polluted water makes it to the ocean. And the assumption is that it's okay and that the ocean can handle it because it's, massive, right? And it's really hard for people to get a sense of the size of the ocean. It looks endless, but it's not. And it's not able to absorb all of these pollutants. It causes harm both to the coastal communities that are receiving them, as well as, and I mean coastal communities as in habitat, like salt marshes or coral reefs or rocky shores, but also the people that live in those communities, because it can sicken those people by eating the shellfish or eating the fish that are contaminated. It can create problems with harmful algal blooms. That's when there's way too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water from nutrients like human waste or agriculture. And it creates these big explosions of algae, and that they call them, you've heard maybe of brown tides or red tides. That's when this explosion of algae occurs in the water, and it actually creates really nasty conditions for all of the other ocean life, because it sucks up all the oxygen in the environment in the end, and can basically suffocate the organisms that are living there and cause dead zones. So you'll see that in places like the Gulf of Mexico. So, so it's not, you know, one of the reasons we're having this happen. Now you're talking about what we flush down our toilet, but there are a lot of people in the world that don't have toilets. In fact, 2.5 billion people don't have access to a toilet, not even like a pit latrine. There's another 2 billion people that don't have access to a safe toilet. So that means their toilet is directly discharging into the environment like a pit latrine, so something that doesn't have any kind of treatment. So more than half of the world is without safe sanitation. So we have this global sanitation crisis. Now that is happening in the developing world. That is predominantly happening to poor countries, to countries, so it's happening to really the marginalized populations and on our planet, right? So that is a huge contributor to all of this. So there's these interesting interconnections between public health and ocean health in this space. But what happens is, in the developed world, most of us have toilets, and it's a flush it and forget it mentality. We don't want to think about it. It's very taboo, right? To talk about our bodily functions and poop and pee. These are things that people sometimes are just shocked to hear me say. And then others all of a sudden are like, you broke the seal, let's talk. I want to tell you everything about my experience in this, in my, you know, wild and weird life. So it's something that we don't want to talk about, we don't want to think about, and therefore, you know, it's really nice that it gets flushed away and we assume that it's all taken care of. But one of the things you will find when you start getting curious about where you are is that things may not be getting managed as well as you would like or hope. And it may actually be having an impact on your community that you're not aware of.
Yeah. So as far as communities that are doing a good job of managing their sanitation and not putting untreated sewage or I assume even industrial waste, those kinds of things, into oceans and water systems, who would be doing a good job of their management?
Whew. That's a really hard question to answer, because every system that I am aware of, and obviously I am not I'm not all knowing. I'm not familiar with every municipality's system, but they all have problems, the ones that I'm aware of. And these are a function of them oftentimes being old, having been built at a time when our population wasn't as large and as dense. So I'll give you an example. New York City is a place that has extraordinary treatment systems. They have these massive buildings that treat their wastewater, and it's sort of, you know, it's like state-of-the-art sewage treatment. But whenever it rains in New York City, they have a problem, and they start discharging raw sewage into the Hudson River Basin, because their system is designed, it's called a combined sewer overflow. And basically the rainwater flows into pipes that combine with the sewer water. So when it rains, that treatment plant can't handle that volume of water, and it has to discharge. So they are discharging in just New York City alone, 27 billion gallons of untreated sewage on an annual basis into their waters. Okay, so a combined sewer overflow is a common engineering solution that is used in many cities in North America and in Europe and other places. we all know now that, and these were put in place, like I said, maybe 100 years ago or more. We all know now that these are not great systems for large populations because of these discharges that have to occur. And so there are some parts of the world that are actually going in and retrofitting and trying to adjust and adapt and close off pipes and redirect stormwater into other locations so that they're not having to pollute, and that water can go to the plant and get treated where, as it was intended to do. So that's an example of where you think you've got this incredible system, but it's got this major weakness. Another example is septic systems. Septic systems are used in a lot of rural environments. They're also used in a lot of actually more urban environments, surprisingly. And they fail, and they are not well maintained, and they're not well monitored. So you may have a good system in place, but it's not getting managed in the way it should be. So I sort of actually yesterday played a little game where I was looking to see if I Googled a place, a state, I'm American, so I'm looking at all these US states, to see if I could find sewage anywhere I looked, find sewage pollution. And I probably did it for like 5 or 6 places, some cities, some states. And immediately I come up reading 3 million gallon sewage spill, 40 million gallon sewage spill. Like it's in the news, but people try to suppress it. They don't want to talk about it. If you bring it up, they don't want to talk about it because it could affect tourism. It could affect, businesses and industry in those places. So it's just this thing that we're not talking about. And if we don't talk about it, we can't solve the problem. So it's, so I could literally talk about this all day. So what else you got for me?
Well, but that's good. You're right. A lot of times you don't talk about it. And so you get information that's not exactly accurate. Because sometimes I see communities justify and say, oh no, our stuff that we put in is way cleaner. And so you just go, I don't know. And when you talk about, maybe the initial stuff that goes back in is treated, but what happens to the other stuff? And right. I can't believe that over time, you can continue to pump that kind of stuff into the water and it not impact the ocean.
Yeah, and one of the things we're learning about treatment, so there's different levels of treatment. There's primary treatment, and I won't nerd out on this, but that removes the solids. And when you get to tertiary, you're starting to address pathogens and nitrogen and things like that in the water, but not everybody treats to that level. What we are learning is that there are things that aren't treated at that level, like pharmaceuticals. So all the things that we are ingesting, whether that's a chemotherapy drug, an antidepressant, a hormone replacement therapy, antibiotics, recreational drugs, whatever it is that people are consuming and ultimately flushing down the toilet, that's also going into the environment. I'll give you an example. In Seattle, in Puget Sound, there was a study that our national NOAA, our fisheries agency, did. And they looked at treated wastewater that was coming out of a sewage treatment plant that was a high standard of treatment. And what they found, they looked for about 85 or so different contaminants, and they found about 45 of those contaminants in the treated water. So they found cocaine, caffeine, antidepressants, whatnot, that was flowing out of the treatment facility. But then they also found those contaminants in baby fish that were swimming nearby and in the waters a little bit away from the area. So they could tell they were tracking and showing those contaminants showing up in other areas. So even treated water isn't necessarily safe for the environment or for people. Those drugs have effects on people and the organisms that are exposed to them.
And obviously, you've focused on this area, and it's not as easy as just one answer. Obviously, it's very complex. It's developing versus developed. How old is your treatment system? And you're right, and what's going into it. I'm just curious, I know there's not an easy answer, but is there something that communities can do to help raise awareness of this issue, to see if they can do better?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different things around solutions that are exciting. The first thing is really understanding what's going on in your community is the first step. So when people ask me, what should I do? What can I do? The two things I say are talk about it. We need to talk about this. We're not going to solve it without raising the awareness around it and having, solution-oriented conversations. But it's also just learn about what's happening where you are. If you are a part of a municipal sewer system, find out what level of treatment and where that water goes, what's happening in those receiving waters. Are they testing the habitats there, whether it's river or ocean, to make sure that they're not being impacted by that? If you have a septic system, is it getting monitored on a regular basis? Does it need some maintenance? So finding out what's happening to you, most people don't know. That's what I have found. Most people aren't aware of that. And you can't solve a problem that you don't know about. So that's one thing I would encourage communities to do, is to get curious. Individuals, get curious about what's happening where you are. The other thing is that there are really interesting solutions coming on board. Now, in North America, there are a lot of sewered centralized treatment plants, right? And this seems to be like the cutting edge. The reality is that's not always the best or most affordable solution, and they're hard to maintain. They break down. You need a lot of financing to manage that in the long term. There are a lot of other types of solutions out there, but sewage treatment plants aren't very efficient. So there's one issue here. So sewage treatment globally contributes to 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a lot. It's a big piece of the pie when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. Sewage treatment plants emit carbon dioxide, they emit methane and nitrous oxide. So all the bad ones. And they're energy hogs as they do that treatment. So that's a problem, right? And that's only treating 20% of our sewage, making that kind of contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. The cool thing about all of this, and what I'm most excited about in this space, is that you can capture water from wastewater. You can take the term waste out of wastewater. You can capture water and it can be recycled back into drinking water. This is done around the world. I always love to use the Orange County in Southern California example. They've been doing this for 30 years. They've been drinking their wastewater by treating it and just putting it back through the system and making it safe for people to drink. You can capture fertilizer because human sewage is so rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. Like each person produces about 10 pounds of nitrogen a year. So, human waste is very valuable. So you can capture for fertilizers, capture the nutrients from sewage, and you can also capture fuel and actually have a negative effect, which is truly a positive effect on carbon emissions by taking that fuel, natural methane that's a part of human waste, and turning it into fuel. So I'll give you an example. The poop of 1 billion people translates into $400 million in methane gas that can be used as fuel to power somewhere between 10 and 18 million households. So there's like this massive solution around this that actually can draw down carbon rather than create a problem. So there are high tech and low tech and small and large scale ways to do all of the things that I've just described. And that's what's exciting when people think about, well, what are we going to do in our community? You can start looking at ways to make your community more sustainable. Not only do you address the threat of pollution, but you also can capture resources that are expensive to procure and are limited, right? Water is limited, phosphorus is limited. And so there's a cool opportunity here we're leaving money on the table. The valuation of human poop is 10 billion a year in fuel. So $10 billion is being left on the table by not capturing the value of the resource.
That's great. I mean, and it's nice to see when, you can take a crisis or something that's not positive and turn it into an opportunity if you just look at it from a different lens. And that sounds like what you're doing now. So before we wrap up, is there anything else maybe I didn't mention or ask you about?
One thing that is really important to me, and it's really important in talking about environmental issues, is the intersectionality of these problems. And by that, I mean, this disproportionately affects communities of color, and it disproportionately affects women. And I think it's really, another getting into solutions. I'll give you, again, one more example. When we talk about solutions, we talk about maybe putting in a toilet in a community. And one of the things we've learned, those that work in the sector, in the sanitation sector, have shared with me, is that it's not that simple. You've got women and girls in India, for example, that going to a community toilet would be unsafe. So they risk sexual assault or some sort of violent assault by going to a community toilet. So they practice open defecation, they hide, they go somewhere in an unpredictable location and time to do, their basic bodily functions that everybody has to do on a daily basis. So when that becomes life or death for them to be human, you have to start thinking about this in a really different way and appreciate not only what you could do for those women and girls by giving them access to safe sanitation. One of the big ones is allowing girls to continue school. So in a lot of places, because there's not a safe toilet or a toilet at all at school, once girls reach puberty, they stop going to school. So all of a sudden, by solving some of these problems that are sort of upstream, I think of to the issue I'm most focused on, can have this huge downstream effect by having girls ending up getting to continue in school because they have safe toilets. You have all these other positive effects on the community. There's this recent project called Project Drawdown. I encourage people to go and learn about it. If you're not familiar with it, you can check it out at drawdown.org, where they looked at the top 100 solutions to drawing carbon down out of the atmosphere, actually trying to reduce our carbon in the atmosphere, which is a really, crazy idea. I mean, it's brilliant. I don't know why we haven't been talking more about it. And the top combined, when you empower women by giving them a choice as to when they have their children, having them make that decision, and educate girls, that is the most powerful thing you can do to address carbon drawdown, to address climate change. And that's because women are, once you get them into the problem space or the solution space, they really contribute in very different ways, and they make more sustainable long-term decisions for their communities. So it's crazy to me when you start looking, I'm like, wow, you just put in a safe toilet, then girls get educated, then they grow up to, be problem solvers in their communities, and then they're making good sustainable decisions for the environment, and there's less pollution, and climate starts getting addressed. I mean, it's just really fascinating how all interconnected all of this work is, and it's so, like I say, it's a really fun space to work in and think about and get creative in terms of how to solve the problem. So there isn't a simple solution, but you can see how interconnected it all is and how important it is especially for marginalized populations. And that speaks to me really strongly in the work that I do.
Thank you for taking the time today to just shed a little light on this issue, and all the best as you continue to work in the area and make some meaningful impact in the communities where you're working. So thank you.
You're very welcome. I really appreciate the opportunity. I always love to talk about this stuff. So thank you.
You don't find it a crappy topic to talk about?
No, not at all. I'm a big fan of potty talk.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.